Hello and welcome to Unveiling the Findings, State of Chinese Americans Survey 2024. I'm Cindy Tsai, Interim President and General Counsel for Committee of 100. I'm honored to be here to discuss what has been a nearly year-long journey and will provide a brief overview of this year's survey, introduce you to our distinguished panelists and moderator, and outline today's webinar schedule. For those of you who are attending a Committee of 100 event for the first time, welcome. And for those of you who have attended our events previously, welcome back. Committee of 100 is a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded 35 years ago. Our dual mission then is the same as it is today, to advance the inclusion of Chinese Americans in the United States and to foster constructive relations between the United States and Greater China. Committee of 100 began conducting public perception surveys in 1994, gathering valuable data on a wide range of issues to inform policymakers on both sides of the Pacific. In 2022, Committee of 100 produced its inaugural State of Chinese American Survey, which examined the diverse groups that constitute today's Americans of Chinese descent, the problems they face, and the perspectives they hold. This research targets critical issues concerning the Chinese American identity, experiences of racial discrimination, as well as views and opinions on politics and policies, including U.S.-China relations. For our 2024 survey, Committee of 100 partnered with NORC at the University of Chicago, one of the largest independent social research organizations in the United States, to collaborate on conducting and analyzing the survey and its findings. I want to take this opportunity to thank our esteemed advisory group, consisting of Committee of 100 members, Gordon Chang, Daphne Kwok, and Jeremy Wu, all of whom provided indispensable support to the success of this research. Today is the formal launch of the 2024 survey report, and all of you are the first to hear about our findings. After this event, you could download a copy of the executive summary from our website. We will also put a link in the chat box. Over the next hour, our speakers will discuss the methodology used to conduct the survey, as well as the survey findings on the issues relating to Chinese American identity, discrimination and prejudice faced by Americans of Chinese descent, and Chinese American views on current politics, as well as the state of U.S.-China relations. We will ask you to participate in today's event by responding to our polling questions, as well as by asking questions. Joining us today is Alex Chiu, Director of Client Services and Business Development at Amplify AAPI with NORC. Alex will discuss NORC's role in the survey, the purpose of building Amplify AAPI, and its plans for the growth of this panel. The three researchers of this survey will also be joining us. First, we have Dr. Vivien Leung, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Santa Clara University. Vivien will present on the survey methodology and the chapter on Chinese American identity. Next, we have Dr. Nathan Ming Chang, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Loyola Marymount University. Nathan will cover the issues surrounding discrimination and hate. And lastly, Dr. Sam Collitt, researcher and data scientist at Committee of 100. Sam will examine the respondents' views on politics and the state of U.S.-China relations. I want to thank our moderator, Daphne Kwok. Daphne is the Vice President of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Asian American and Pacific Audience Strategy at AARP. She is on the advisory group for this year's State of Chinese American Survey. Daphne is a Committee of 100 member, and she also serves on the Advisory Council for Amplify AAPI at NORC. For general housekeeping, we encourage everyone to submit questions related to this research at any time throughout the webinar in the Q&A box. We will address the questions in the later portion of the event. Also, once the webinar concludes, an option to complete our post-event survey will appear on your browser. Please take a couple of minutes to complete the survey, as your feedback is very important to us. As a reminder, today's event is being recorded. The video will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel in the coming days. Thank you very much for your time and enjoy the presentation and discussion. To begin today's discussion, Alex Chu will introduce NORC and Amplify AAPI.
Thanks, Cindy. We're excited to share the results today. We'll give you a little background on NORC and Amplify API. NORC at the University of Chicago is an objective, nonpartisan research organization that delivers insights, analysis, decision makers trust. NORC has been a pioneer in social science and data science research for more than 80 years. NORC has a long history of creating probability-based survey opinion panels for hard-to-reach underrepresented groups. We saw that due to inadequate sample sizes and inaccurate data representation, AA and HPI communities were historically and systematically excluded from conversations, policies, budget allocation, and services. NORC, along with partners such as AARP and funders like RWJF, Blue Shield of California, AAPI Data, and Rockefeller, felt the diverse needs and stories of the AA and HPI communities deserve to be told with complete accuracy, and Amplify API, the first, the only, and the largest, most representative public opinion panel of AA and HPIs was created. Panelists are recruited and surveys are conducted online and phone in English, Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, and Korean, making the research conducted with Amplify API truly representative of the AA and HPI community. Without this panel, standalone surveys of AA and HPI populations would remain prohibitively expensive and of poor quality. Currently, we have around 3,000 members, but our goal over the next 2 to 3 years is to grow this panel incrementally to 7,000 members. And this will allow us to look at disaggregated data for the 7 largest Asian ethnicities. Vivien will provide more insight into the methodology, but the Committee of 100 used the Amplify API panel to conduct the State of Chinese American survey, going to over 500 Chinese Americans 18 plus. NORC and our Amplify API team were proud to conduct this research for a Committee of 100 because the questions and insights gained from this survey are the reasons why Amplify API was created, to allow our story to be told, used to influence real change. The Chinese community, the whole AA and HPI community, no longer wants to be seen as other or asterisk when it comes to survey data. We believe it's critical that organizations like the Committee of 100 continue to use their platform to tell these stories. Now, Dr. Vivien Leung will briefly introduce the survey methodology and then present what the survey uncovered about Chinese Americans' sense of self-identity and belonging.
Thank you so much, Alex. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Vivien Leung, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Santa Clara University. Let me first start by just briefly walking everybody through the methodology of our study and how we got to our data. Right. So as some of you may know, Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group in the United States, and the Chinese American population in particular is large and growing. With this population growth and with the ongoing pandemic and anti-Asian hate, Chinese Americans continue to face many different forms of discrimination. We also know very little about Chinese Americans' specific political opinions and behaviors, since a lot of studies, like Alex just mentioned, tend to aggregate Asian Americans together. So the research team at C100 put together a survey of 49 questions on a broad range of topics. We partnered with NORC's Amplify AAPI survey panel, and in total, we recruited 504 Chinese American respondents. What we will do today is discuss some of the responses to our survey and do some comparisons within group. As always, if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend checking out our executive summary and full report. So first, I would like to start off by talking about Chinese American identity and belonging. A big takeaway I want folks to keep in mind is that a lot of what we find has a clear nativity and age gap. So for example, many of the younger Chinese Americans are born in the US today rather than abroad. Unsurprisingly, with that kind of nativity difference, younger Chinese Americans are significantly more proficient in English than older Chinese Americans. We also want to highlight some findings about cultural acceptance. Most Chinese Americans are not optimistic about how their culture and values are being perceived. by other Americans, although younger people are somewhat more optimistic than older folks. Chinese Americans also that regularly experience discrimination are less optimistic about acceptance of their culture and values. So first, I have a question for the audience. If you guys would like to take a guess as to what is the naturalization rate of Chinese Americans in general. So if you guessed 78%, that is correct. That's actually slightly higher than the total percentage of immigrants who naturalize who are able to. That is 76%. So we actually have a slightly higher rate of Chinese Americans naturalizing in the US relative to all other immigrant populations. When we look at the Chinese American population, we can see that a majority of Chinese are born outside of the US. However, there is a growing younger population of 18 to 29-year-olds who are born in the United States. We expect these numbers to increase as time goes on. So a lot of what you'll see today here will be broken out by nativity and as well as age group. When it comes to English proficiency, generally speaking, Chinese Americans in our sample noted that they spoke English either very well or well. Unsurprisingly, as younger Chinese are more likely to be born in the US, younger Chinese Americans have the highest rates of English proficiency compared to other cohorts. And we can also see that older Chinese Americans, age 60 and up, are the most likely to rate their English proficiency as not well. So when we talk about cultural acceptance, we asked our Chinese Americans in our sample about whether or not they viewed Chinese American values and cultures as being more widely accepted. Only a third of our sample, 33%, felt that Chinese or Chinese American culture was becoming more widespread or accepted. About 41%, the majority of our samples, said that they felt the acceptance rate remained somewhat about the same. And 18% noted that they felt that Chinese culture was actually becoming less accepted over time. This lukewarm view may have to do with the ongoing pandemic and anti-Asian hate. We'll actually explore that later in this webinar and at length in the executive summary and full report. So we wanted to break down this view about cultural acceptance. And when we break it down by age, we actually find that younger Chinese Americans feel a little bit more optimistic about cultural acceptance than other age groups, right? A little more than half of Chinese Americans aged 18 to 29 felt that Chinese American, values and cultures were becoming more widespread and accepted. And you can see that number drops off a lot more when looking at older age cohorts. We were curious to see if these views on cultural acceptance were colored, right, by experiences with discrimination. Here on this slide, you can see views on cultural acceptance divided by individuals who experienced discrimination and those who did not. So the blue on the left-hand side, the blue bars indicate individuals who noted that they've experienced discrimination in an average month. The green on the right are individuals who noted that they have not experienced discrimination. So as you can see, experiencing discrimination is associated with less optimism about cultural acceptance overall. Next, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Nathan Chan, who will delve into the survey results on racial discrimination and its effects.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Vivien. I'm going to be discussing a crucial part of our survey that continues to gauge potential experiences with racial discrimination and its compounding effects on the everyday lives of Chinese Americans. So we're going to highlight just several key findings from our survey. The first was that we found that large proportions of Chinese Americans continue to face racial discrimination in everyday life. We also find that this discrimination manifests in a lot of different ways. So for example, as it ranges from more implicit microaggressions to more explicit forms of hate. Additionally, we identified that experiences with racial discrimination among Chinese Americans are associated with worsening mental health, which we'll elaborate in just a second. And lastly, we find that with all of this happening over the last couple of years, Chinese Americans are very dissatisfied with how elected officials are handling the problem of violence in their own communities. But before we delve into more of the data, I'd like you all to speculate on the following question. What proportion of Chinese Americans face at least one form of discrimination in an average month? Okay, so thank you for participating in that activity. The 2024 State of Chinese American Survey actually found that 68% of Chinese Americans still experience at least one form of racial discrimination in an average month. So this suggests that racial discrimination has persisted into 2024, even 4 years since the onset of COVID-19. Moving on, in our survey, we also wanted to dig deeper into the types of discrimination that the Chinese American community faces. And we certainly identified a wide variety of experiences with racial discrimination, ranging from more implicit to more explicit hate. We find that more than a majority, 54% in that blue bar at the top, reported that others have assumed that they are not from the United States. 26% reported that others acted as though they did not actually speak English, and 14% said that others intentionally mispronounced their names. However, we found that the discrimination doesn't actually stop there. 27% reported in an average month that they had been called names or been insulted, and 6% reported that they had been spit or coughed on in an average month. In the next slide, we investigated how reporting of discrimination varied across age and found that younger Chinese Americans were more likely to report these experiences than older Chinese Americans. So overall, while 48% of Chinese Americans over the age of 60 report regularly facing discrimination, which is already a pretty large proportion, over 70% of Chinese Americans between the ages of 30 to 59 and nearly 86% of Chinese Americans between 18 to 29, our youngest group of Chinese Americans, reported the same. And this finding echoes previous research over the years after the pandemic that also finds that younger Asian Americans are more likely to report anti-Asian hate, and that's something that we can address more in the question and answer. Our next set of analyses spotlights discrimination across gender, and we find that Chinese American women also report experiencing discrimination more than Chinese American men do. 75% of women indicate that they face some kind of discrimination in the average month compared to 60% of men. So this finding really emphasizes the uniquely troubling discrimination at the intersection of race and gender among Asian American women. Our survey also suggests that experiences with this discrimination are indeed taking a toll on Chinese Americans' struggle with their mental health. So we asked how often respondents felt a variety of different mental health symptoms over the last 30 days. And we found that while the shares of Asian Americans who report feeling, for example, hopeless, nervous, depressed, or worthless were already relatively high among those who did not experience racial discrimination regularly, that this struggle increases substantively and is associated with larger increases among Chinese Americans who do actually regularly experience that racial discrimination. So that is across mental health indicators, across all of these indicators, it seems to worsen upon encounters with racial discrimination. So it makes sense then that when we asked, how would you rate the job that federal elected officials are doing dealing with violence against Chinese Americans, we found that Chinese Americans were relatively dissatisfied with elected officials' responses to racial violence. 51% of Chinese Americans said that federal elected officials were doing a bad job of dealing with anti-Asian hate, while only 20% said that federal elected officials were doing a good job. And lastly, kind of given the concerns about the lack of sufficient government response, we did want to follow up by asking Chinese Americans about what they think would indeed be the most effective action to prevent this violence from still occurring in the year 2024. We confirmed in our study that Chinese Americans believe that political and policy actions are the most effective solutions. Almost a majority of Chinese Americans in our sample, 46%, said that making laws against hate crimes stronger was the most effective way to prevent violence against Chinese American communities. This was a single option choice. About a quarter said that they preferred increased election of more Chinese Americans, suggesting that Chinese Americans do want to see elected representatives in government that they can relate to, that they can understand, and they feel like will be a little bit more of an advocate of the particular needs of this Chinese American community. So based off of these findings, right, I'd like to kind of end with several policy recommendations that we came up with the committee to reduce racial discrimination. So in response to the still alarmingly high rates of racial discrimination experienced by Chinese Americans in everyday life in an average month, we continue to call for greater legislative and administrative efforts to collect discrimination and hate data disaggregated across Asian Americans' national origin groups. In alignment with the preferences of Chinese Americans for solutions to racial violence, we also recommend stronger policy and legal enforcement to reduce discrimination and combat xenophobia. In addition, in alignment with views and preferences identified among Chinese Americans in the survey, we propose the creation of more pipeline programs to prepare more Asian Americans and Chinese Americans specifically to run for office so that this could lead to more government focus on community-specific issues on various levels of politics. Lastly, in our response to our finding on deteriorating mental health, we recommend more investment into mental health resources for Chinese Americans. And with that, I will go ahead and pass the presentation along to Dr. Sam Collitt, who will discuss the last portion of our survey findings on how US-China relations impact the lives of Chinese Americans and the political preferences of this community.
Thanks, Nathan. Hi, everyone. Like Nathan said, I'll be presenting the last two sets of findings, starting with how the perceptions of Chinese Americans, how those perceptions are related to US-China relations and how that affects their lives. So Chinese Americans, like what we know about the general public from other research, perceive that relations between the US and China are in a poor state. Majority of Chinese Americans say that US-China relations negatively impacts how other Americans treat them and others of Chinese descent. We looked at three potential mechanisms by which bad bilateral relations may negatively affect Chinese Americans, including domestic policies such as foreign property ownership laws that ban Chinese citizens from owning property, where 2/3 say that such legislation negatively affects how Chinese Americans are treated by the public. And the other two mechanisms concern how topics related to China and US-China relations are communicated to the public, where we find that a majority of Chinese Americans say that the rhetoric and language used by US news media when reporting on China and US-China relations negatively affects how strangers treat them. And last, the manner in which politicians, specifically presidential candidates, discuss China and US-China relations, where we find that 4 in 5 Chinese Americans are at least a little concerned about how presidential candidates talk about these topics. But before we move to discuss our findings, I want to provide a little bit of context of the general public's perceptions of China over time, as found in other high-quality research. So as seen in the figure on the left, the public's opinion of China has become increasingly unfavorable since 2017, to the point that nearly half of the public has a very unfavorable opinion of China. Alongside this trend, you can see in the right-hand figure, the proportion of the public that sees China as a serious threat to US interests has nearly doubled to 58% over the same time period. So while communication to the public about COVID-19's Chinese origins certainly has accelerated and exacerbated the public's negative opinions of China in 2020 onward, we can also likely point to the Trump administration's messaging and policies around China as an economic threat as a catalyst of negative public sentiment toward China starting in 2017. And we know from other research that negative public sentiment of a perceived foreign threat produces negative sentiment towards individuals perceived to be aligned with that threat, which in this case is China and Chinese Americans, as well as other Asian American individuals that are mistakenly identified as Chinese. So while COVID-19 discrimination of Chinese Americans may be in decline, we're likely to see more discrimination directed at Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans stemming from the continued rise in anti-China policies, as we've just recently seen in Congress's China Week, and politicians' negative messaging about China to the public, as we've recently seen candidates try to pin their competitors as closely tied to China. So now, as we've done for the previous sections, I'd like to ask the audience here, what proportion of Chinese Americans do you think describe the current US-China relationship as positive? So the answer is only 7%. So the answer is only 7%, while 89%, or nearly 9 in 10 Chinese Americans describe the relationship as either somewhat or very negative. So we followed up by asking respondents what impact, if any, do you think that the current relationship between the US and China has on how other Americans treat them and others of Chinese descent? And we find that nearly 2/3 say that current bilateral relations negatively impacts how other Americans treat them and fellow Chinese Americans. And as I mentioned earlier, we investigated the effects of particular downstream policy communication effects for US-China relations. And in particular, we asked how foreign property ownership laws, which are being considered and passed in many states, affect how Chinese Americans are treated. So as we found from other Committee of 100 research, the majority of this legislation prohibits Chinese citizens from owning property, and a significant subset of this prohibits even permanent US residents with Chinese citizenship as well. And so we asked what impact such laws have on how Chinese Americans are treated, and we focused on the effects of treatment by the public rather than any legal effects, because most of the legislative efforts have happened in the last couple of years, and many of the legal effects are not yet borne out. And so while about 1 in 4 Chinese Americans say that such laws have no impact on how they're treated, about 2/3 say that such laws have a negative impact on how other Americans treat them. We then moved to ask about the perceived effects of communication and messaging to the public about China and US-China relations. And specifically, we asked how much confidence respondents have in the US news media when it comes to reporting the news on China and US-China relations fully, accurately, and fairly. And we find that about half of Chinese Americans express little or no confidence in the US news media to do just this. And we followed up by asking how the rhetoric and language that US news media uses when talking about China and US-China relations affects a variety of relationships. So the percentages here indicate the proportion of respondents that said that the rhetoric and language that US news media uses in discussing these matters has either a somewhat negative or very negative impact on how a given category of people treat them and other people of Chinese descent. We find that 61% say that how the US news media talks about China negatively impacts how strangers treat them, and even closer relationships are significantly negatively impacted. For instance, about 1/4 of Chinese Americans say that the acquaintances and coworkers treat them worse as a result of how the news media talks about China. And while we don't show these stats here, the vast remainder of these percentages indicate that how the US news media talks about China has no impact on how they're treated by others. So as you might imagine, hardly anyone said that how the US news media talks about China produces a positive impact on how they're treated by others. And to note, we do generalize to all of US news media in this question, and there may be significant variation among the specific news sources that we didn't ask about. And we hope to expand on this question in subsequent surveys to get a more nuanced understanding of the news media landscape in this way. Finally, we asked about the degree to which Chinese Americans are concerned about how presidential candidates talk about China and US-China relations. And we find that 3/4 say that they're at least a little concerned about this, and about 30% say they're very or extremely concerned. And we followed up by asking why respondents are concerned in an open-ended question. So on the right is a word cloud indicating the most commonly used words in respondents' answers. And on the left are the 3 most common themes that emerged from these responses. So at the top there, you can see that the most common answers concern how the public adopts the language and views of presidential candidates and how the public follows suit. The second theme that emerged regards concerns about policy views expressed by presidential candidates being put into effect once in office, particularly concerning limits to civil rights. And the third theme concerns a reinforcing feedback loop between negative or hostile rhetoric directed at China and deteriorating relations to the point of war. So we arrive at our set of recommendations based on these findings, and first, we advocate for more efforts to document the impact of domestic policies and language around US-China relations on the lives of Chinese Americans and other Asian American groups. Last year, I believe, Stop AAPI Hate and Chinese for Affirmative Action launched its Stop the Blame campaign, which has done an outstanding job of bringing awareness to these issues, but there still remains a dearth of data on the negative impacts that we've discussed here. And relatedly, as a means to develop a strategy to reduce these negative impacts, we think it's especially important to understand what the rest of the public thinks about the effects of US-China relations and downstream domestic policies and communication has on the lives of Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans. And last, we advocate for more bias and sensitivity training for members of the news media and policymakers when discussing China and US-China relations to help reduce instances of sweeping, xenophobic, and inflammatory language that may negatively impact the lives of Chinese Americans. So last, we'll discuss our findings on Chinese Americans' partisan identities, their voting behaviors, and political opinions. And this section is relatively brief, as we reserve most of the discussion of policy opinions in the full report. So first, we find that about 3/4 of Chinese Americans say they're certain to turn out in 2024, including almost 9 in 10 registered voters. And second, we find, consistent with other research on Asian Americans, that the plurality of Chinese Americans identify as Democrats, while the remainder is roughly split between Republican and nonpartisan or independent identification. Third, we find that Chinese American Republicans' support for Donald Trump is significantly weaker than Democrats' support for then candidate and former President Joe Biden, or now President Joe Biden, who was the Democrats' de facto nominee at the time the survey was conducted this year in March. And we also find that 3/4 of Chinese Americans say that the country is headed in the wrong direction, which is mostly consistent with the views of the general public. And also consistent with those views, Chinese Americans view the economy as the top issue, and the plurality say that the economy is getting worse. And we don't have time to discuss these findings here, but we surveyed Chinese Americans' positions on a wide variety of policy issues, and as you can imagine, mostly find expected partisan splits, and that independents don't sort neatly with either party, but you'll have to wait for the full report to get all the details on those findings. So first, as you can see on the chart on the left, we find that 86% of Chinese American citizens report being registered to vote. And from the charts on the right, about 3/4 of citizens say they are certainly planning to vote in November, including 87% of registered voters. On the left here is the self-reported partisanship of the general public polled during the same period as our survey in March. And you can see roughly equal proportions of Democrats and Republicans with a few independents or nonpartisans. So in contrast to this, we find a clear plurality of Chinese Americans identify as Democrats, while only 31% identify as Republicans. And these are leaners as well as those that either weakly or strongly identify as either party. And 24% identify as independents or don't hold any partisan identity, which is over double the percentage reported by the general public. Next, we find that Chinese Americans that identify as Republicans express lower levels of support for Donald Trump than Democrats have for Joe Biden. So in the figure on the left, we have the percentage of each partisan group that voted for a given presidential candidate in 2020. And we see that 97% of self-identified Democrats report voting for Joe Biden, compared with only 67% of Republicans that report voting for Donald Trump. And to corroborate this, in the figure on the right, we show that the percentage of each partisan group that expressed a favorable opinion towards Joe Biden and Donald Trump, who were both the de facto major party nominees in March, again, when this survey is done. And we see that 75% of Democrats had a favorable opinion of Biden, compared to only 58% of Republicans that have a favorable opinion of Trump. We think this is an especially profound set of findings, as one's partisanship is typically the most influential predictor of many political behaviors and opinions in contemporary politics, including vote choice and policy positions, which is to say that among the general public, comparably high rates of Democrats and Republicans voted for their party's candidate in 2020. And at the time the survey was conducted, partisans in the general public expressed similarly high rates of favorability toward their party's de facto nominee. And to note, while we're unable to draw comparisons between support for Harris and Trump, because we fielded the survey before Biden dropped out, we expect these findings to hold for Harris and Trump as well, as AAPI Data and API Vote released a report recently that finds comparable levels of support for Harris among Chinese American voters. So we included a classic political polling question that asked respondents whether they feel things in this country are generally going in the right direction, or whether they feel things have pretty seriously gotten off on the wrong track. And we find that majorities of all Chinese American partisan groups express dissatisfaction with the status quo, saying that things have gotten off on the wrong track. And in line with this previous finding, we also find that when asked whether the economy is getting better or worse, and as I mentioned, this is the top issue identified by Chinese Americans, that pluralities of all partisan groups say that the economy is getting worse. And these last two findings are generally aligned with other surveys of the general public conducted during this same period. So next, Vivien will provide our set of key takeaways and recommendations based on the findings presented here today.
Thank you so much, Sam. So it's clear from the committee's report that racial discrimination is an ongoing and pernicious problem that plagues the Chinese American community. So we have come up with several policy recommendations and takeaways to help combat this. The first is, of course, greater policy and enforcement efforts to fight against discrimination. Right. The second is, more reporting resources for AAPIs that have experienced discrimination, such as AAPI hatetracker.org and/or FBI statistics, things that are more accessible for the regular person. Finally, as Dr. Chan pointed out, we need a lot more investment at the state, local, and federal level into mental health resources for Chinese Americans. And for folks who are interested, we elaborate more on those recommendations in the full report and the executive summary. So now we will open it up to some questions from the audience, and Daphne Kwok will be moderating the Q&A.
Thank you so much to everybody, all the panelists, for your contribution. And looks like we have a great range of questions, so thank you all. So the first one that we want to ask is, what outreach and responses were performed through community leaders or grassroots organizations, such as Chinese schools or churches? And I think Alex will take that question.
Thanks, Daphne. So the way we conduct this panel, it's probability-based and completely randomized. So we can't target any specific groups. So there's no connection in that way. How we work with the community organizations is that we speak with them to learn how to tailor our collateral. So when they are recruited, if they're randomly recruited, there's language in there that can connect with them. So they'll be more likely to be engaged with the panel. In addition, we're working with community organizations to raise awareness of Amplify API. So if they are, again, randomly selected, there'll be that brand recognition of Amplify API, and they won't think it's fraudulent.
Great, thank you. Next question that we have, how do the mental health challenge statistics compare to non-Asian people? Nathan, maybe you can help us there?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Daphne. I think this is a great question to ask about, relatively, what's going on with the Asian American community compared to other groups. So prior to the pandemic, there has been research to suggest that there were indeed unique struggles that Asian Americans faced with their mental health, such as thoughts of suicidal ideation. However, since the pandemic, there are also studies to suggest that mental health symptoms have increasingly gotten worse uniquely for Asian Americans, right, relative to other non-Asian groups. And our survey findings do confirm that there is an association between experiences with racial discrimination and worsening mental health even 4 years since the pandemic. So I would say that this suggests that we need to continue monitoring these issues together, both in terms of race, racism, xenophobia, and also mental health symptoms.
Thank you. Next question that we have, what is the voting participation rate of Chinese Americans out of the ones who are eligible to vote? What percentage of Chinese Americans are eligible to vote? Vivien?
Yeah, thank you, Daphne. This is a great question. So the estimates are roughly 2.4 million Chinese American adults that are eligible to vote out of a community of about 5.4 million in total. And so about 4 in 10 Chinese Americans are born in the US, and we have about 120,000 or so naturalizing every single year. And so we have a huge percentage of the population that is eligible to vote, right? A little over about 2.4 million in total. However, Chinese American voter turnout was actually some of the lowest voter turnout that we have seen among Asian Americans in 2020. We're looking at only about 55% of registered Chinese Americans voted in the 2020 election. In contrast, about 71% of registered Indian Americans voted in 2020. So we're seeing huge sum of the population that is eligible to vote, but we're not seeing enough voter turnout relative to other AAPI communities.
Great, thank you. Here's another great one. Did the study adopt any definition of discrimination, or a respondent's discriminative experience is based on one's self-assessment? Maybe Sam, can you help us there?
Yeah, thank you, Daphne. So we had many items that asked whether respondents have experienced some form of what we understand to be discrimination in, I believe, an average month. This question is mostly derived from the California Health Institute's study of AANHPI individuals. And so we didn't have a preset, we didn't ask whether respondents were discriminated against per se. We asked whether they had certain experiences which we know to be discriminatory. And we also followed up and asked for respondents that did select whether they've experienced a given kind of discrimination, what they think that the motivation was. And I believe 85% of respondents said it was they understand that the motivation to be either their ethnicity, race, name, or accent. And so clearly, I think those factors indicate some sort of racial discrimination, but we asked about all kinds.
Wonderful. I think the next one, Nathan, can you help us with the next one, which is, as we observe increasing media narratives portraying China and the Chinese community in a negative light, and politicians doubling down on such narratives, but what meaningful actions can we take to counteract these efforts?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question and something that our unique data has really spotlighted. And I want to acknowledge that the person that asked this question presented this idea and solution of positive storytelling. And I think that that's really important because what we found in our data is that immigrant groups often carry the stigmas and stereotypes that arise from how politicians talk about policy issues occurring in their place of birth governments, right? And this alarmist rhetoric used to talk about transnational issues do impact the treatment of Chinese Americans in everyday life. So as negative rhetoric has affected the everyday lives of Chinese Americans, right? Thinking about positive words and positive storytelling and kind of pushing that forward as a important narrative that for Chinese Americans, I think is going to be really important to combat some of this negative media rhetoric, negative politician rhetoric that is kind of doubling down in the election cycle today.
That one's a very, very important question that I think we all need to be working towards solving. The next question, I think maybe Vivien can help us with. 18 to 25-year-old AAPIs don't vote. They think it's useless and won't change a thing. How can we motivate them to get off their TikTok world and participate instead of opting out?
Yeah, so this is not unique to just AAPI youth. In general, young people across the United States do not vote. And to kind of even pull that back even further, only about a third of eligible voters in the United States vote at all. So one thing that I want to stress is that Young people's voter participation has actually increased. We saw the largest percentage of young youth voter turnout in 2022, which was a midterm election, which is usually unheard of. And a couple things I want to stress is that electoral systems matter, right? Young people are more likely to be living in states that they are not registered in, right? They're either going to college out of state or they are renting and moving around a lot. And so making it easier for young people to vote either by permanent mail-in ballots, making it easier for them to register, more voter access is something that we know for a fact turns out more young people. And politicians also need to turn out younger voters, right? They need to show younger individuals that, you know, their issues and their problems and their the things that they are worried about are things that politicians are interested in as well, right? And so I think I'll turn it over into Nathan to kind of talk a little bit more as well.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to jump in, and I think this is like a perennial question in political science about like why don't people vote, right? And there's like previous research to show this is the American public writ large is that young people actually have fairly high levels of political interest, right? But why then do we see high levels of political interest, but a gap when it comes to voter turnout between younger and older Americans? Right. And one of the answers that scholars of racial and ethnic politics have kind of provided for us is really looking at this idea of recruitment. Who is recruited into politics and does outreach matter? We know that from from decades of work that one of the largest indicators of whether or not you're going to turn out to vote is whether or not you were recruited and whether or not you were outreached to begin with. Right. But what we are finding decades and decades again is that Asian Americans are the least likely to be outreached relative to all other racial groups. Right. So this is not just a psychology, political interest problem. It's also a larger structural problem with how much the Asian American vote is perceived to matter.
These are all great and very, very timely questions. Sam, for the next one, did you see significant differences in the responses based on the socioeconomic backgrounds?
Yeah, we did. It depends on the kinds of questions. So for instance, questions about nativity, identity, experiences with discrimination. There's a lot of variation by age group, as well as by gender. But of course, on questions of political participation, I mean, we know classically that people that are, have higher educational attainment and higher income levels are more likely to register to vote, to turn out, and so on and so forth. And so that's primarily where we see a lot of the socioeconomic differences. But primarily, a lot of the significant differences between groups occurred by age and gender.
Great. Next question. Wow, we've got a trove of great questions. This one's for Vivien. Maybe you can help here. How does party affiliation vary by place of birth?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing I will say is that in general, younger Asian Americans and younger Chinese Americans are a little more likely to be registered as either not affiliated or moderate and or Democrat. What this means in practice is that about 2/3 of Asian American registered voters and Chinese American registered voters vote Democratic. In contrast, only about a third vote for Republicans, at least in the general presidential cycle. Some of that has to do with birthplace, as the question mentioned. Folks who are born abroad are a little more likely to be conservative than not. But I do want to stress that in general, Chinese Americans and particularly Asian Americans are not terribly strong Democrats or Republicans, and you can read more about this actually in the executive summary. But we do see some differences in affiliation by nativity and kind of birthplace of origin.
Great. There was one question I saw, and I think for Alex, there was one question about the respondents. Where do they come from geographically?
Yeah, we can, send out more information on that later, but we weight our data to be representative of the census. From our recruiting, as you can imagine, we do have a larger population from the AA and HPI community from California. But the way we do our weighting, we try to rebalance that to be representative of the US.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I think we have a question here that Nathan might be able to help us with. How has teaching Asian Chinese culture and history in K through 12 classes affected the general sense of belonging for Asians and Chinese Americans? And will having a federal law mandating such teaching in our classes create a stronger sense of belonging?
Yeah, this is a great question. Not exactly something that our survey could get into, but we know that these types of ethnic studies classes are being implemented across different states, across the United States, right? Some of my outside research has demonstrated that when students are asked to take or take, right, a racial and ethnic politics class that centralize the political positioning and information about marginalized groups in the United States, that it can actually increase their senses of racial inclusion, right? And it could also elevate people's senses of kind of importance of racial equity and recognitions of racial discrimination, and also support policies that are geared towards advancing kind of like the marginalized status of racial and ethnic groups in the United States. So that can probably speak to a little bit of what we might expect some of these courses on specifically Asian Chinese history, Asian American studies, to also help foster and create a sense of belonging among people who are not part of that racial group. What we also know is that when racial minorities are included in the text on civic education, so for example, when Asian Americans are represented in civic education as an important group in American society, right, there's evidence to suggest that this could also increase their senses of political efficacy and their likelihood of, for example, engaging in politics, right? So education does matter.
Thank you. We know that there are a lot of efforts that are going on at the state level to pass such legislation. We really want to thank the audience for giving us so many great questions that we could respond to. And at this time, I would like to ask each of the speakers, give us your 1-minute conclusion before I close us out. So maybe we can start with Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Daphne. I'm really excited, as I mentioned in the beginning. It's important for organizations like Community 100 to continue to using Amplify PI, but just data in general. There's not enough amplification, not enough data out there sharing the voices of the A and HPI community, and it's really important. As far as going into leading to the election, some of the data that we've run for other organizations as well as C100 it's promising, especially for the younger 18 to 34 groups. I think it was 67% said they would absolutely certainly show up, and nearly 95% for the 18 to 34 said they would absolutely or fairly certain will vote. So, we'll see what the exit polls say, but it is promising to see, the potential that the young ANHPI community will turn out.
Thank you, Alex. Vivien.
Yeah, I think I want to highlight that kind of despite the ongoing pandemic and anti-Asian hate that still persists, we're actually seeing a lot of that translate into a desire for political change, which I'm really hopeful to see that manifests into kind of continued engagement by Chinese Americans, either in voting or running for office, or even, things like becoming more interested in politics as it affects them. And so I, encourage folks in the audience to, again, check your voter registration status and stay updated where you can.
Excellent. Nathan?
Yeah, thanks so much for hosting all of us here, and thanks so much to all the participants for engaging with us in a really thoughtful discussion. Yeah, I'd like to actually ask for everyone's help here to kind of keep their eye out on issues that are disproportionately impacting our community. advocating for more research on Chinese Americans in particular, helping us distribute our report when it's ready in a couple of weeks, right? And just spotlighting some of the quote unquote, that some of these older issues are still prevalent in our communities, such as racial discrimination, even 4 years after COVID. And now these are kind of manifesting in like different and contemporary ways, such as this negative rhetoric that we're hearing about how Chinese Americans are responding to some foreign policy discussions, right? So there's still a lot that we need to keep our eye out on. If you get the question about why do Chinese Americans matter, right? We are a fast growing ethnic racial group in the United States with the potential of being the margin of difference for areas in a lot of states across the United States when it comes to the 2024 election. So to study elections will essentially require that we grapple with Chinese American political attitudes and their voting behavior as we go forward.
Thank you. And Sam, to round us up.
Thanks, Daphne. I think it's especially important to continue to collect more data about, for instance, how things like the House of Representatives China Week, a large variety of both domestic policies as well as communication about those policies and about the rhetoric, for instance, of candidates, congressional, presidential, pinning each other as being closer tied to the Chinese government, really has downstream effects for how Americans kind of adopt those views and that rhetoric and how that negatively impacts the lives of Chinese Americans and other Asian American individuals. We don't really have that much data on this, and it's in order to develop a solid plan to address it and to reduce these forms of discrimination, we really have to understand it. So yeah.
Data. We need more data. Well, we're at the top of the hour. We really want to thank each and every one of you for spending your very precious time to be with us. This concludes our session, the Committee of 100's unveiling of the findings State of Chinese American Survey 2024. Thank you so much and have a great day.